I was a mechanic they framed for parts theft, until I proved the boss was running a chop shop. But that morning, standing in Tony Marcelli's cluttered office, with grease still under my fingernails, I had no idea my 15-year career at Eastside Automotive was about to end with a lie. Tony's thick fingers drummed against his desk, the same nervous tick he'd developed whenever the quarterly numbers came in short. His eyes wouldn't meet mine, instead focusing on a manila folder that sat between us like a loaded gun. The fluorescent light above flickered with that familiar buzz, the one I'd been meaning to fix for 3 months, casting sickly shadows across his weathered face. He slid the folder toward me with the careful precision of a man handling evidence. Inside, photocopies of invoices, parts orders, and what looked like security footage stills. My stomach tightened as I recognized my own face in the grainy black and white images, apparently removing parts from the inventory room after hours. The setup was elegant in its simplicity. 3 high-end catalytic converters missing from inventory. Security footage showing me in the parts room at 11:47 p.m. last Tuesday. My employee access card logged at exactly that time. Even a falsified work order with my signature authorizing the removal. I flipped through the evidence, my mind racing to piece together how they'd constructed this frame job. The signature was close, too close for comfort, but I could see the subtle differences in the letter spacing. The timestamp on the security footage bothered me. I'd been home watching the Lakers game that night, but proving it would be my word against their documentation. Tony's mouth moved in what I assumed were explanations, justifications, maybe even apologies. I watched his lips form words about disappointment and trust, about having no choice, about this being as hard for him as it was for me. His hands gestured toward the folder, then toward the door, then back to the folder in a choreographed dance of false regret. The other mechanics had gathered near the bay doors, their faces a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Miguel wiped his hands obsessively on a rag, his usual nervous tell. Danny stared at his feet while Jake leaned against a hydraulic lift, arms crossed, studying me with the cold assessment of a man calculating his own survival. I closed the folder and placed it back on Tony's desk with deliberate calm. My hands didn't shake. 15 years of precision work had taught me control. But inside, fury built like pressure in an overpressurized system, contained for now but seeking release. The walk to my toolbox felt eternal. 30 years of accumulated tools, each one selected with care, maintained with pride. The snap-on ratchet set my father had given me when I started the apprenticeship. The German torque wrenches I'd saved 3 months to afford. The diagnostic equipment that had made me one of the best transmission specialists in the city. I loaded everything into milk crates with methodical precision, aware that every eye in the shop tracked my movements. The younger mechanics whispered among themselves, probably calculating how this affected their own positions, their own security. In an industry where trust meant everything, being labeled a thief was a career death sentence. Tony emerged from his office as I wheeled my tools toward the exit, his face arranged in what he probably thought was sympathetic concern. He gestured toward the payroll office, indicating my final check was ready. 2 weeks' pay minus the value of the allegedly stolen parts. The mathematical precision of the theft stung worse than the accusation itself. The security guard, a kid I'd never seen before, probably brought in specifically for this moment, held the door open with exaggerated courtesy. His eyes held that particular mixture of authority and nervousness that marked him as new to the power that came with the uniform. Outside, the Automare carried the smell of motor oil and exhaust, familiar scents that now felt like goodbye. My truck sat in the employee lot where I'd parked it every morning for 15 years, next to the dumpster where Tony stored old parts catalogs and broken office equipment. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment, letting the engine idle while I processed what had just happened. The radio crackled with traffic reports and morning talk shows, the mundane soundtrack of people heading to jobs they still had. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked older somehow, marked by a betrayal I was still learning to carry. The drive home passed in a blur of familiar streets and traffic lights. Every auto shop I passed felt like a reminder of doors that would now remain closed. Word traveled fast in the automotive community. By noon, everyone would know about the mechanic who'd stolen parts from Tony Marcelli's shop. But something bothered me about the whole setup, a detail that picked at the edge of my consciousness like a loose thread. The timestamp on that security footage, 11:47 p.m. I'd noticed earlier that the timestamp was off by exactly 3 hours from the actual time the system displayed. A glitch Tony had been meaning to fix for months. At home, I spread the photocopied evidence across my kitchen table, and studied it with the same methodical attention I'd bring to diagnosing a transmission problem. The work order signature wasn't just close to mine. It was traced from an actual signature, probably from one of the hundreds of invoices I'd signed over the years. The security footage bothered me most. The angle was wrong, showing too much of the inventory room and not enough of the person supposedly removing the parts, almost as if it had been staged specifically to create evidence while obscuring details that might prove innocence. I opened my laptop and began researching California employment law, workers' rights, and the legal requirements for termination based on theft allegations. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that Tony had followed every legal protocol with surgical precision, too precisely for a man who usually cut corners on everything from employee documentation to safety inspections. My phone buzzed with text messages throughout the day. Word was spreading faster than I'd expected. Miguel expressing disbelief and support. Danny asking if I needed anything. Jake's message was shorter, more cautious. Just checking in, he said, but I could read the distance already creeping into his words. By evening, I'd started a notebook, documenting everything I could remember about the past few months at the shop. Late-night phone calls Tony had taken in his office. Unusual deliveries that came after hours. Cars that appeared in the back lot overnight and disappeared just as quickly. The pattern emerged slowly, like a picture developing in solution. High-end vehicles with suspicious paperwork, parts orders that didn't match the work being performed. Customer complaints about charges for new parts when their old parts had been functioning fine. Tony Marcelli wasn't just running an auto repair shop. He was running a chop shop operation, and I'd been framed because I'd gotten too close to discovering it. The realization hit me like an electrical shock, sudden, painful, and illuminating. 3 months ago, I'd questioned a work order for a BMW that required a complete engine replacement, despite showing minimal wear. Tony had dismissed my concerns, claiming the customer had specifically requested the work, but the old engine had been pristine, barely broken in. 2 weeks later, I'd noticed that same engine serial number on a parts invoice for a different BMW that had come in for minor bodywork. When I'd mentioned the coincidence to Tony, he'd grown defensive, claiming computer errors in the inventory system. Last month, a customer had complained about being charged for a new transmission when theirs had been rebuilt just 6 months earlier. Tony had handled the complaint personally, offering a discount and claiming the technician had made an error in documentation. That technician had been me, and I'd made no such error. I spent the evening creating a timeline, cross-referencing dates with my own work records, customer complaints, and parts orders I could remember. The scope of the operation became clearer with each connection. Tony wasn't just stealing parts. He was systematically harvesting high-quality components from customer vehicles and selling them through a network of black market dealers. The framing made perfect sense now. I'd been asking too many questions, noticing too many discrepancies. Rather than risk exposure, Tony had decided to eliminate the threat by destroying my credibility. If I tried to report the chop shop operation now, who would believe a mechanic fired for theft? But Tony had made one crucial mistake. He'd relied too heavily on his reputation and my apparent disgrace to protect him from scrutiny. He'd assumed I would slink away quietly, damaged and defeated. He'd underestimated the methodical persistence that had made me good at my job. I opened a new document on my laptop and began planning. Not revenge, not yet, but investigation. Documentation. Building a case that would not only clear my name, but expose the entire operation. The first step was understanding the scope of Tony's network. I needed to identify the other participants, the supply chain, the money flow. Most importantly, I needed evidence that would convince authorities who had no reason to trust my word over an established business owners. Over the next 3 days, I developed a routine. Morning runs that took me past the shop, noting unusual activity in vehicle movements. Afternoon visits to auto parts stores where I casually inquired about recent purchases from Eastside Automotive. Evening research sessions diving deeper into business records and state licensing databases. The picture that emerged was staggering. Tony's legitimate repair business was just the front for an operation that had been harvesting parts for at least 2 years. High-end catalytic converters, ECU modules, luxury vehicle transmissions, components worth thousands each on the black market. His customer base provided perfect cover. Wealthy clients who trusted the shop's reputation and rarely questioned detailed work orders. Insurance companies that processed claims without extensive verification. A cash flow that mixed legitimate repair income with illegal part sales, making the operation nearly invisible to casual inspection. But every system had vulnerabilities, and I was beginning to identify Tony's. His documentation was too perfect, too consistent for the chaotic reality of auto repair work. Real shops had discrepancies, errors, occasional confusion. Tony's paperwork read like it had been designed by someone who understood how investigators would analyze financial records. The new security guard was another tell. Tony had never invested in professional security before, relying on basic door locks and a decades-old alarm system. The sudden addition of overnight security suggested he was protecting something more valuable than standard shop equipment. Most importantly, Tony's behavior had changed in subtle ways that became obvious once I knew what to look for. The increased paranoia, the defensive reactions to routine questions, the careful control over who had access to which areas of the shop. I spent a week documenting these observations, building a comprehensive picture of the operation's structure and timing. But documentation alone wouldn't be enough. I needed irrefutable evidence, the kind that would force authorities to act regardless of their initial skepticism about my motives. The breakthrough came during one of my morning runs past the shop. A flatbed truck was loading a pristine BMW engine in the pre-dawn darkness, supervised by Tony himself. The careful way they handled the engine block, the professional equipment they used, the coordination of their movements, this wasn't scrap removal or standard disposal. I followed the truck from a distance, staying back far enough to avoid detection, but close enough to track its destination. The warehouse district on the east side of town, a complex of industrial buildings where legitimate businesses mixed with operations that preferred less scrutiny. The truck disappeared into a bay door at Apex Auto Salvage, a business I'd heard rumors about but never investigated. According to public records, Apex specialized in recycling damaged vehicles and selling used parts to budget-conscious customers. But the pristine BMW engine suggested their operation included significantly more valuable inventory. Over the next few days, I researched Apex exhaustively. Business licenses, environmental permits, employee records, customer complaints. The owner, Vincent Santos, had a history of minor violations and regulatory disputes, but nothing that suggested major criminal activity. But buried in the State Environmental Protection Database, I found something interesting. Apex had recently applied for permits to handle hazardous materials disposal, specifically for electronic control units and catalytic converters. The volume they'd requested permission to process was far beyond what a standard salvage operation would require. I began monitoring both businesses, noting the timing of deliveries, the types of vehicles involved, the patterns of activity that connected them. The operation was more sophisticated than I'd initially realized, involving not just Tony's shop, but at least 3 other auto repair businesses and 2 salvage operations. The scope of the network explained why Tony had felt confident framing me. With this much money and this many participants, eliminating one suspicious mechanic was just a cost of doing business. They probably had contingency plans for dealing with other potential threats, but they'd made their plans based on the assumption that I would react emotionally, either trying to clear my name through futile legal channels or simply disappearing to rebuild my career elsewhere. They hadn't planned for a systematic investigation that would expose the entire network. I spent another week documenting the connections between the businesses, mapping the flow of vehicles and parts through the system. The operation was generating millions of dollars annually, sophisticated enough to include money laundering through the legitimate repair business accounts. But sophisticated systems created sophisticated vulnerabilities. The more complex the operation, the more points of failure it contained. And I was beginning to understand exactly how to exploit those weaknesses. The plan that formed in my mind was ruthless in its simplicity. Rather than trying to prove my innocence directly, I would force Tony to reveal his guilt. Instead of defending against his accusations, I would put him in a position where exposure of the chop shop operation would be his only defense against much more serious charges. It would require patience, precision, and a willingness to take risks that could backfire catastrophically. But 15 years of methodical problem solving had taught me that the most elegant solutions often required the most careful preparation. I opened a new notebook and began planning Tony Marcelli's downfall. The first phase required establishing myself as a credible source of information. Despite my termination, I still had contacts throughout the automotive industry, relationships built over 15 years of professional competence. I began reaching out carefully, not to discuss Tony's shop directly, but to gather intelligence about the broader market for stolen auto parts. The conversations were revealing. Several mechanics mentioned unusual requests from customers looking for specific high-end components at below-market prices. Parts dealers complained about competition from unknown suppliers offering genuine OEM parts without proper documentation. Insurance investigators had noticed patterns in certain types of claims, but lacked evidence to pursue formal investigations. I positioned myself as someone researching a potential business opportunity, exploring the legitimate used parts market. Nobody questioned my motives. A recently unemployed mechanic looking for entrepreneurial opportunities was perfectly believable. Within 2 weeks, I'd identified at least 6 other auto repair shops that were likely participants in the network. The pattern was consistent. Established businesses with good reputations, owners who'd recently upgraded their facilities and equipment, customer bases that included high percentages of luxury vehicle owners. But identifying the network wasn't enough. I needed evidence that would force authorities to act, and that evidence had to be obtained without breaking any laws myself. My plan required Tony to incriminate himself, to create a situation where covering up the chop shop operation would be impossible. The opportunity came through Miguel, who'd started texting me regularly with updates from the shop. Tony had been increasingly paranoid since my termination, requiring all employees to sign new confidentiality agreements and installing additional security cameras throughout the facility. But the paranoia was making him sloppy in other ways. Miguel mentioned that Tony had been working late most nights, often staying until well after midnight. The new security guard only worked until 10 p.m., leaving Tony alone in the shop during the hours when the most sensitive operations took place. I began timing my evening runs to coincide with these late-night sessions, observing from a distance as expensive vehicles arrived and departed under cover of darkness. The operation's scope was even larger than I'd realized. They were processing 3 or 4 vehicles per week, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal parts sales monthly. But Tony's late-night presence created an opportunity. If I could document his personal involvement in the operation, it would be impossible for him to claim ignorance or blame subordinates. And if that documentation came to light during an investigation of other crimes, it would be admissible evidence, regardless of how it was obtained. The plan I developed was complex but elegant. Rather than trying to expose the chop shop operation directly, I would create evidence of related crimes that would inevitably lead investigators to discover the parts theft network. Tony would find himself caught between multiple investigations, forced to choose between confessing to the chop shop operation or facing charges for much more serious offenses. It started with the tax records. Business income that included millions in unreported cash transactions would inevitably attract IRS attention. But the IRS moved slowly, and their investigations could take years to develop. I needed something more immediate, more dramatic. The environmental angle proved more promising. The improper disposal of catalytic converters and ECU modules violated numerous state and federal regulations. Environmental crimes carried serious penalties and attracted aggressive prosecution. More importantly, environmental investigations included extensive surveillance and documentation that would inevitably reveal the underlying theft operation. I spent a week researching the specific regulations that applied to auto parts disposal, identifying the violations that would trigger the most serious investigations. Then I began documenting Tony's violations with the methodical precision of a man building a legal case. Photographs of improper waste disposal behind the shop, documentation of hazardous materials being transported without required permits, records of electronic components being processed without environmental compliance measures. But environmental violations alone might result in fines and compliance orders rather than criminal prosecution. I needed something that would guarantee Tony's personal involvement and create genuine legal jeopardy. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Danny had mentioned that Tony was planning to expand the operation, potentially opening a second location in a different county. The expansion would require significant capital investment and careful coordination with his existing network. Expansion meant vulnerability. New locations, new employees, new regulatory requirements, new opportunities for mistakes. Most importantly, expansion meant that Tony would have to document his operations more extensively, creating paper trails that could be traced and analyzed. I decided to accelerate that timeline, to force Tony into expansion decisions before he was fully prepared. If I could create market pressures that made rapid growth seem necessary, he might make mistakes that would expose the entire operation. The strategy required understanding Tony's business psychology. He was fundamentally greedy, driven by the appeal of easy money, but also paranoid about threats to his operation. If I could create the impression that competitors were moving into his territory, he might react aggressively, making the kind of bold moves that would attract unwanted attention. I began spreading carefully crafted rumors through the automotive community, stories about new players in the high-end used parts market, suggestions that established suppliers were losing market share to unknown competitors, hints that certain repair shops were struggling to source the specialized components their customers demanded. The rumors were designed to create urgency without directly threatening Tony's operation. Instead of suggesting that law enforcement was investigating, I implied that business opportunities were disappearing. Greed would motivate him more effectively than fear. Within days, Miguel reported increased activity at the shop. Tony was working even later, taking more phone calls, meeting with people Miguel didn't recognize. The paranoia was shifting into aggressive expansion mode, exactly as I'd hoped. But I needed more than increased activity. I needed documented evidence of criminal behavior that would force law enforcement to act. And that evidence had to be obtained in a way that couldn't be traced back to my investigation. The solution came through my research into environmental regulations. Anonymous tips to environmental protection agencies were not only accepted, but encouraged. Citizens could report suspected violations without identifying themselves, and agencies were required to investigate credible complaints. I prepared a comprehensive report documenting the environmental violations I'd observed at Tony's shop and the Apex salvage operation. Improper disposal of hazardous materials, transportation of electronic waste without required permits, processing of catalytic converters without air quality compliance measures. The report was detailed enough to demonstrate serious knowledge of the operations, but focused entirely on environmental crimes rather than theft. Environmental investigators would discover the underlying parts theft network through their own investigation, making my role invisible. I submitted the report through an anonymous online portal, then began documenting additional violations that would support follow-up complaints if necessary. The environmental investigation would take several weeks to develop, giving me time to prepare the second phase of my plan. But environmental crimes alone might not result in the complete destruction of Tony's operation that I was planning. I needed something more personal, something that would guarantee his individual prosecution and prevent him from simply closing the shop and disappearing. The answer came through studying Tony's financial records. Public documents showed that he'd recently purchased an expensive home, 2 luxury vehicles, and a boat. Purchases that far exceeded the legitimate income from his auto repair business. The lifestyle upgrades were funded by cash transactions that would be difficult to explain during a financial investigation. Tax evasion was a federal crime with serious penalties and aggressive prosecution. Unlike environmental violations, tax crimes carried the possibility of significant prison time and asset forfeiture. Most importantly, tax investigations included comprehensive financial analysis that would reveal every aspect of Tony's business operations. But triggering a tax investigation required evidence of specific violations, not just suspicious lifestyle choices. I needed documentation of unreported income, cash transactions, or business expenses that couldn't be legitimately justified. The opportunity came through my continued surveillance of the late-night operations. Tony was meeting with parts dealers every few days, conducting business that involved large cash payments. If I could document these transactions and provide evidence that the income wasn't being reported, it would trigger an inevitable tax investigation. I began photographing the late-night meetings from a distance, using a telephoto lens to capture license plates and facial recognition shots. The meetings followed a consistent pattern. Tony would meet with different dealers in the shop's parking lot, exchange briefcases or packages, and complete transactions that took less than 15 minutes. The briefcase exchanges were particularly incriminating. Large cash transactions in the auto parts business were unusual enough to attract attention, but briefcase exchanges suggested deliberate efforts to conceal the nature and scope of the business being conducted. After 2 weeks of surveillance, I had documented over a dozen meetings involving what appeared to be substantial cash transactions. The participants included the owner of Apex Salvage, representatives from parts dealers across 3 counties, and individuals whose expensive vehicles suggested significant financial resources. But photography alone wouldn't be enough to trigger a tax investigation. I needed evidence that the transactions involved unreported income, and that evidence had to be obtained legally and presented through channels that would protect my anonymity. The solution came through researching IRS whistleblower procedures. Citizens could report suspected tax violations anonymously, and the IRS was required to investigate credible complaints involving substantial potential revenue loss. I prepared a second anonymous report. This one focused on Tony's financial activities and the discrepancies between his reported income and apparent wealth. The report included detailed observations of cash transactions, documentation of lifestyle purchases that exceeded reported income, and analysis of business expenses that appeared inconsistent with legitimate auto repair operations. The combination of environmental and tax investigations would create overlapping scrutiny that would make it impossible for Tony to cover up any aspect of his operations. Environmental investigators would discover evidence of financial crimes, while tax investigators would uncover evidence of environmental violations. The two investigations would reinforce each other, creating a web of legal jeopardy that would prevent Tony from simply paying fines and continuing his operations. But I wasn't finished. Tax and environmental investigations move slowly, often taking months or years to develop. I needed something more immediate, something that would force Tony to make desperate choices that would accelerate his downfall. The third phase of my plan focused on the relationships that made Tony's operation possible. The Chop Shop network depended on trust between participants, careful coordination of timing and logistics, and shared confidence that law enforcement wouldn't discover their activities. If I could shatter that confidence, the network would collapse as participants prioritized their own survival over collective success. Fear would make them sloppy, desperate, and ultimately self-destructive. I began planting evidence that one of the network participants was cooperating with law enforcement. Nothing dramatic or obvious, just subtle suggestions that someone was providing information to authorities. A business card from a federal investigator left in a location where it would be discovered and reported. Anonymous messages warning network participants about increased law enforcement attention. Carefully crafted rumors about ongoing investigations that included specific details only an insider would know. The psychological pressure was designed to create paranoia and suspicion within the network. If participants began suspecting each other of cooperation with authorities, they would start taking defensive measures that would ultimately expose the entire operation. Miguel's reports confirmed that the strategy was working. Tony was increasingly suspicious of his employees, customers, and business partners. He'd installed additional security measures and was conducting counter-surveillance to identify potential threats. But paranoia was making him more active, not less. Instead of reducing his operations to minimize exposure, Tony was accelerating them in an apparent effort to generate enough cash to disappear if necessary. The increased activity was creating more evidence, more opportunities for mistakes, and more visibility that would eventually attract official attention. The acceleration was exactly what I'd hoped for. Tony was being forced into making the kind of bold, risky decisions that would guarantee his eventual capture. But I needed to ensure that when the collapse came, it would be complete and irreversible. The final element of my plan involved creating a situation where Tony would have no choice but to personally participate in the most incriminating aspects of his operation. If he tried to distance himself from the Chop Shop activities when investigators closed in, he needed to be so thoroughly implicated that denial would be impossible. I began creating artificial market pressures that would require Tony's direct involvement in high-value transactions. Anonymous inquiries about specific luxury vehicle components that would be extremely difficult to source through legitimate channels. Hints that major buyers were looking for large-volume suppliers who could provide consistent access to high-end parts. The inquiries were designed to appear like genuine business opportunities that were too valuable to delegate to subordinates. If Tony took the bait, he would be personally involved in transactions that would provide irrefutable evidence of his central role in the operation. Within a week, Miguel reported that Tony was pursuing several major new business opportunities that required his personal attention. He was working even longer hours, meeting with new contacts and planning transactions that would involve the most valuable components his network could provide. The increased activity was creating exactly the kind of evidence that would make conviction inevitable once investigators began their work. Tony was building his own case against himself, driven by greed and the false confidence that his operation was too sophisticated to be detected. But the most satisfying element of my plan was still to come. When the investigations finally resulted in arrests and prosecutions, when Tony's empire collapsed and his participants faced serious prison time, the evidence that destroyed them would include documentation that proved I'd been framed. The same forensic analysis that revealed Tony's financial crimes would also expose the fabricated evidence used to justify my termination. The security footage that supposedly showed me stealing parts would be revealed as manipulated. The work orders with my forged signature would be identified as fraudulent. My innocence would be proven not through my own efforts to clear my name, but as an inevitable byproduct of the investigation that destroyed my accusers. The vindication would be complete, undeniable, and perfectly ironic. 3 months after my termination, the Environmental Protection Agency conducted their first inspection of Tony's shop. They found extensive violations of hazardous waste disposal regulations, improper handling of electronic components, and documentation proving systematic non-compliance with air quality standards. The environmental investigation led to a more comprehensive examination of the business operations, which revealed financial discrepancies that triggered automatic notification to tax authorities. The IRS began their own investigation, focusing on the substantial unreported income that environmental investigators had uncovered. Within weeks, both agencies had requested assistance from local law enforcement, citing evidence of criminal activity that exceeded their regulatory authority. The multi-agency investigation that followed was exactly what I'd planned: comprehensive, overlapping, and impossible to escape through partial cooperation or selective confession. Tony tried to control the damage by closing the shop temporarily, claiming equipment failures and regulatory compliance issues. But the investigation had expanded to include his entire network, making shutdown of the primary location irrelevant to the ultimate outcome. The salvage operation was raided 2 days after the shop closure. Vincent Santos was arrested on multiple charges related to illegal parts trafficking, money laundering, and environmental crimes. His cooperation with investigators provided detailed information about the scope of the network and Tony's central role in coordinating operations. Within a month, 6 auto repair shops had been searched and closed. 14 individuals had been arrested on charges ranging from theft and fraud to tax evasion and conspiracy. The total value of the stolen parts was estimated at over $8 million. Tony's arrest came on a Tuesday morning. I watched from across the street as federal agents surrounded his house, serving warrants for tax evasion, conspiracy, and operating a criminal enterprise. The man who destroyed my reputation with fabricated evidence was led away in handcuffs, his own crimes proven beyond any possibility of denial. The forensic analysis of the evidence used to frame me was included in the federal case documents. The manipulated security footage was exposed as fabricated. The forged work orders were identified as fraudulent. The timing discrepancies were documented as proof of deliberate deception. My innocence was established not as a separate issue requiring defense, but as evidence of Tony's consciousness of guilt and his willingness to destroy innocent people to protect his criminal operation. The frame job was presented as proof of the sophisticated planning and ruthless execution that characterized the entire enterprise. The vindication was perfect in its completeness. Not only was I cleared of all accusations, but the evidence of my innocence was integrated into the case that would send Tony to federal prison for the next 15 years. 6 months after my termination, I received a call from the State Labor Department. Tony's business assets were being liquidated to pay restitution to victims of his crimes. As a wrongfully terminated employee, I was entitled to compensation that included back pay, benefits, and damages for career harm. The settlement amount was substantial, more than I would have earned in 5 years at the shop. But the money was secondary to the satisfaction of watching Tony's empire crumble exactly as I'd planned. Miguel called to tell me that several of the mechanics from the shop were starting their own business, and they wanted me to join as a partner. The automotive community had rallied around me once the truth was revealed, and my reputation was not just restored, but enhanced by the recognition of what I'd endured and overcome. I drove past the empty shop building on my way to meet with my new partners. The windows were covered with legal notices and foreclosure signs. The hydraulic lifts sat motionless in bays that would never again hide stolen parts or fabricated evidence. Tony Marcelli had tried to destroy my life with lies, believing that reputation and authority would protect him from consequences. He'd learned too late that methodical intelligence and patient planning could overcome any advantage wealth and position might provide. I parked across the street and sat for a moment, looking at the empty building that had once represented everything I'd worked to achieve. The shop was gone, but my career was stronger than ever. The man who'd framed me was in federal prison. The network he'd built was destroyed. Justice wasn't just served, it was served cold, methodically, and with the precision I'd brought to every job I'd ever completed. Tony had taught me that reputation could be destroyed with lies. I taught him that truth would eventually surface, and when it did, the reckoning would be complete. I started the engine and drove toward my future, leaving the wreckage of Tony Marcelli's empire in the rearview mirror where it belonged.